The stand coming from opposition is not going to contend with any argumentation of government that seems to prove the harms of these corporations onto the environment and to the degree in which they pollute the environment. What we're going to contend with you in this debate is the extent on which ecotourism is able to garner political and social traction to spark a long-term solution, and whether a long-term solution can exist inherently within ecotourism, as what they seem to come and tell you. So my argumentation later on will be talking about how a legitimate policy making process will be heated when you have any forms of eco-terrorism fighting in the means to do it. But what I'm going to talk to you about before that is the idea of long-term solution being able to be achieved under that solution. So first, let's talk about any other alternatives that exist in status quo other than eco-terrorism, because they seem to go on the line of logic that the people who are polluting the environment are people who will be able to be affected by things like fines, because they're able to pay it off. But the logic is counterintuitive then. If corporations are profit making and seem to make the most amount of profit at the least amount of cost, then why not you create a fine that's able to tap into the profits of these individuals and cut into the profit, so they do not have an incentive to then pollute the environment. But more than that, they even argue to you that discussion will be able to be created when we have eco-terrorism fighting against corporations. But this completely neglects TJ's argument, because TJ came and told you the nature on people on the ground. We're talking about moderates who look up to the state for their own purview on what they feel is eco-terrorism. When NGOs like Greenpeace support acts of terrorism, that doesn't necessarily mean that people will believe that, because these are things, or these are acts in which they're supporting which are radical. The act of destruction, the act of the infliction of harm to individuals on the ground or polluting environment may achieve whatever end goal that you want, but the act inherently in itself is something that is violent, something that doesn't apply to any moral framework that any moderate sitting in this room would believe. Would you believe on the ground that the act of hurting yourself or the act of hurting any other individual just like yourself is something that's inherently good for whatever motive that you're going to achieve? Because for that argument to fly, the argument also has to acknowledge the nature in which terrorism in itself is able to garner positive and constructive discourse to solve whatever aims in which that particular terrorism is trying to achieve. We're talking about terrorism across the board. Under any other context, they have to deal with that particular intuitive argument in itself. So we think the idea of discussion doesn't necessarily happen under their model, because for the failure of engaging with TJ telling you that people are going to feel that this is radical, they're not going to subscribe to the idea in handy end of the day, and that's fundamentally problematic when you're talking about garnering social traction. But let's go into my argument on how why we're trying to gain policy making process in this matter. But my arguments will be integrated with my rebuttals. So I'm going to talk to you about how, what is legitimate policy making process. A legitimate policy making process is the government's purview on what it feels is best in creating policies to protect the environment, such as carbon tax, such as measuring your carbon emissions and giving tax in that respect. But also, ladies and gentlemen, we're talking about the ability of governments to then want to create policies. Of course, if you look at across the board, what would drive a government to create such environmental protection policies is the work of NGOs on the ground. Whenever people see a policy that's created, whenever people see a new environmental policy, people will create an environmental policy to the ability of NGOs to lobby for change. So assuming that today in a different context, when we're talking about education, if a new education policy that benefits the people is created, it's because of the ability of the NGOs that support the education policy to be able to lobby for change. There is a logic that we apply to the ability of government to create political change is because of the work that is done by the NGOs in the end of the day. But that is not where the argument stops. The argument stops is when the ability of governments to then create positive policies to benefit the people or benefit the environment under this context is then halted. Because when you look at the idea or the mandate of political leaders at the end of the day, they don't just work for the environment. When you look at Obama doesn't go to the Copenhagen summit and just have the idea of wanting to protect the environment. Because you have to see that if he does create a policy that protects the environment under their context, which environmental terrorism is able to push Obama over the edge and create a long-term policy that protects the environment, people are also going to legitimize the idea that terrorism is able to spark political change. People are going to legitimize the idea that because Greenpeace supported eco-terrorism, that is why Obama created that policy, and this is inherently wrong. Because from the perspective of Obama or the perspective of government that wants to create this form of policies, they will then think that I will not create this policy because on the other half of the coin, I'm going to legitimize the act of terrorism. I'm going to tell the people that it's okay for terrorism to garner my traction or to garner my ability to spark change. And why is this inherently very problematic? Because on the balance of a coin, we don't think eco-terrorism is the only form of terrorism that exists at the end of the day. Because you're talking about other groups that support terrorism as a means of propagating their own benefit. You then legitimize the act of terrorism across the board under any other circumstances. So what then differentiates ISIS propagating its own purview of terrorism in fighting against the discrimination against the Sunni people in Iraq? We don't think that's something that's legitimately good, not sit down. So then you have to ask the question, how is opposition side able to garner better form of political traction when it comes to politicians? This is where we tap into the mindset of people. If you come and tell us the environment benefits everyone at the end of the day, then the destruction of the environment is going to ultimately harm people, right? So the logical framework that we operate under is that we want the people on the ground to then lobby for the particular change at the end of the day. Because people ultimately come to a realization that, oh my God, it's getting hotter, or the haze is something that I cannot be able to tolerate. These kinds of instances are things that are able to spark change at the end of the day, not sit down. But also, if your policy is heavy at the end of the day, it's trying to solve the problem of corporations having the ability to lobby against the government, and therefore the government will never want to create policies to protect the environment, then you create a policy that disallows corporations like Shell from ever wanting to lobby against the government, lobby for the government. You disallow the ability of certain corporations to then have any form of influence on governmental making policies. You allow courts to set a limit on what type of companies are allowed to lobby, what type of companies are not allowed to lobby, because we do not want political parties to then have a certain leverage, or political parties to then want to conform to certain forms of beliefs that are against the environment. But also, ladies and gentlemen, we also have to engage the idea on why their policy is never a long-term solution in the end of the day. Because the government's perspective also comes into this consideration. And the government doesn't protect the environment, it also protects people. The government also has to protect the people working in factories. The government also has to protect people who are logging, because they are still individuals of the state. They still deserve this form of protection. And given the fact that eco-terrorism is something that's illegal, the government has to protect these people. So at the end of the day, the government is inherently working against any form of eco-terrorism. How is eco-terrorism able to put up against A, the might of a big company that can employ security, but B, also a state that's trying to protect the individuals, the very same individuals you're trying to harm to achieve any form of change at the end of the day. So your policy is actually really redundant. Eco-terrorism in itself is not an act, it's able to fundamentally garner change, but also any form of discourse that it tends to achieve will never be able to be constructive, because the only form of discourse that you actually will be able to achieve is something that is negative against eco-terrorism and day. How are you going to persuade a room of moderate people that the act of hurting an individual is something that is legitimate for any other means? Because then you have to prove the greater logic, how terrorism works across the board under any other circumstances. For those reasons, we are very, very proud to oppose. Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, I feel totally ashamed to live in a society with the mindset of opposition that would rather stay with the law that doesn't even help the environment, that continues to pollute the environment, and doesn't fight for a change in the policies to protect the environment more. I feel totally ashamed, and I would rather not live in that society. Let's look at the main issue in today's debate. Why do we have to resort to eco-terrorism? 3 levels of analysis, but let's look at eco-terrorism. Eco-terrorism, they fight for environment. Like, they're the really passionate ones to fight for environment. That's why they only attack those who actually harm the environment the most. But even if they all try to talk so many times that politicians, they all can expose their wrongdoings and all, we don't think it's possible, because these politicians, they're money-minded, they can protect each other. I will explain that later. But let's look at the clash points under this issue. First level, why NGOs? Why especially these people? Because Asha came out and talked to you how there's nobody there to defend the environment. Because these people, they can defend themselves, but environment, they're only living things, but they cannot move about. They can't even protect themselves. Only NGOs can protect themselves. But here's the thing, this just a few NGOs like PATA and Greenpeace and all, but against billions of people, and not everybody is following. Let's give an example of China. China's badly polluted and everybody there's suffering, but is there still efforts to go against that? Currently, no. But let's look also when Asha came out and talked to you, the politicians, they can help these companies for money. Let's face this fact, everybody is money driven, everybody is greedy, they have a heart of greed for money. Money is our new god now. they will still help and protect these companies, even though they're harming the environment. Because even when they harm the environment, they will still get these benefits. Why? For example, they also spill the oil into the river. It's easier to do that than to dispose them properly. They do not buy the filters because they think the filter is too expensive. They wouldn't even filter the air out. But then with this politician help, they're still protected because in the end they have support from the government. But let's look at the response coming from them. Sit down. Firstly, the LO came out and talked about how they can expose the politicians, why they have to provide more transparency. But here's the thing, we already proved to everybody is greedy. These companies can give them money. And after all, we have to consider politicians are still powerful. But even if he wants to say that can still provide more transparency, we don't think so because they'll still help each other. Politicians are still friends. They'll still have the mindset to want money. They can still protect each other. Secondly, they'll talk about they want to create new policies somehow and somehow put out a carbon tax. But let's face it, we already told you so many times how they can protect each other. This carbon tax won't even work. They will have to protect these companies because they still want money. Everybody wants money, and this all. And then thirdly, their response was terrorists will spark. They always think that terrorists can gain traction for these politicians. That because of these terrorists, it sparks these policies change. But let's look at the first response coming from us. It is still good for the environment because even if they can spark policies change are still for the environment. But let's face it, if we still follow them, the change will not ever happen because eco-terrorism is the real main pressure to the government. We have to put pressure on the government to change. If you do not want to use eco-terrorism, how can you pressure the government? NGOs, they try to pressure the government now. But is there any change? Not much change yet. Yes.
If you tell me that governments are the ones protecting these companies in the first place, then tell me how your form of eco-terrorism is able to generate any form of deterrence against Malaysian companies if the government is still going to back them at the end of the day.
Sit down. Because let's see, eco-terrorism, they burn these factories or not, they can't even pollute more, they can't produce more pollutants. How can this government protect them after the factories are gone, after the factory died, after the factory are burned to ashes? The government cannot protect them anymore, they cannot pollute the environment anymore. They think that PRI is illegitimate. When they have pressure from this eco-terrorism, change will happen. But under opposition, there's no pressure, change will not happen. Next, Asha talked to you about why angels, because they'll be born infants. Let's face it, there are no worldwide, but just a few against billions. How much changes can they get? But now we add eco-terrorism with them, they will add all to this influence. Why? Because why did we choose eco-terrorism? These are open spaces for discourse to happen. But let's look at the response coming from them. They also talk about how we have to oppose eco-terrorism because they will be deemed radical. NGO will deemed to be a more radical movement because they go against the law. But let's face it, the law already failed. The state's law failed. China. We proved you so many times how pollutions are so bad there. But even if he says against the law, how this eco-terrorism against the law, we tell you it's still in line with the NGO's principle, which is to protect environment. After all, environment goes first because what happens when environment is hurt, I'll prove to you later in my third level. Next level, why do we have to deter people from harming environment? Here's what we saw. Even if we use argon, because they came out and talk about how argon will cause air pollution, but here's the thing, it's a fair trade-off. We just have some short-term air pollution, then we can further prevent these companies, these factories from further releasing this harmful air to this atmosphere. But let's look at the response coming from that. He's talking about hurting loggers. That's something I can't even understand. I don't think anybody can understand because first response, we're not burning the forest. Forest is important to the environment. That was just a total misstep. But even if you want to say we burn some place with workers in it, here's the thing. We still need permission from NGO to burn. And we don't believe that NGO will need anybody to be sacrificed just to burn that factory because it's producing chemicals. And then next, he's talking about how it will hurt corporations, something like that. But here's the thing. They already create this thing where they don't want to pollute the environment. If they want to pollute the environment, they will have to face the consequences. They have to be aware of the consequences they will have to face. Next, Asha talked to you about how the time sensitivity, global warming, it will harm the North Pole and South Pole, the polar bears there. They have no place to live. The ozone layer, it cannot make it stick again. The UV rays will harm us, causing cancer. And this will cause an irreversible harm. Look, let's look at the response. He's talking about how the state, we don't think that's a legitimate response because firstly, even if we still take eco-terrorism, it's still in line with the principle. We need to protect the environment. We have to resort to this extent just for it because nobody now is defending the environment. Next, we talk about factory owners, how they are money-minded. Especially when they want to clear forests to develop more place. They would just burn the forest down because it's easier than hiring contractors or others to cut down the forest. Let's give an example. Indonesia's haze. It's because of the forest. But let's look at what they'll talk about. Why they'll talk about why would they rather pay the fines when they all can go for all these things that's way much more cheaper. But here's the thing: for example, you want to buy filter to filter the air before they go to the atmosphere. They would rather pay fines because these filters are more expensive than fines. Last issue: why environment is important and justified to protect. Let's face it: when the environment is harmed, it affects everyone. Nobody can escape. Nobody can have superpowers to escape. It needs to be protected. Status quo: sulfur dioxide are released, carbon dioxide are released. It's vulnerable to protection. And then when we talk about this, they respond. People will know it's hotter. But here's a few responses coming from me. They'll be ignored. For example, during the haze time, even if it affects them, they'll just go into the room and on their icons and all, because they will be ignored. They will be ignored. They will just care for themselves. And if you want a society that cares for the environment, if you want the environment to improve, go inside government. Thank you.
Thank you. May I have opposition, please?
It is unfortunate to see a side that is so willing to harm the people for short-term benefits. It is unfortunate to see a side that is willing to forego the rights of individuals to lead happy lives, to forego their welfare, to forego welfare of individuals who aren't directly involved in the pollution of the environment, to be suffering, to hurt them. We find that abhorrent. What am I going to talk about in my speech? I'm going to talk about two things. What's the nature of terrorism, and why is this approach unjustified and aggressive? And secondly, why then does our side of the opposition best advocate for change? Because we need to recognize that the end goal of this debate is for change, right? We need to recognize that at the end of the day, which side of the house best advocates for environmental policies we pass. We don't think the side of government takes that debate. Let's look at the first issue right from the side. What is the nature of terrorism, and why is this approach unjustified? Because we've told you that terrorism isn't something that is necessarily beneficial, right? We've told you how terrorism is how individuals act vigilantly, how these individuals actually harm individuals on the ground. We're talking about arson, we're talking about burning down factories, we're talking about placing nails within trees in order to harm those that lock. We're talking about all these active harms that these individuals, that these eco-terrorists are taking in order to harm individuals, in order to get their message across. Not only that, we're talking about unlawful acts, right? We're talking about acts that are not recognized by the state. And more often than not, these acts are extreme. That's why they're classified as terrorism. You harm individuals not select individuals, but you harm individuals in masses in order to get the message that they so wanted to propagate across. These are the form of harm that we don't think that we think that at the end of the day, the government must be accountable for the people. The government must be then accountable for individuals' welfare. Because we've already told you throughout the entire opposition's case how these terrorists are not accountable for their actions, how there is no check and balance in order to target specific groups of people in order to get the message across. Who are you to say inside government that these eco-terrorists will only target select groups of individuals? Who are you from government to say that these harms will not get out of hand? We think ultimately at the end of the day, these actions are extreme, something that will not win the support. We think that they're unlawful, unjustified, and illegitimate in nature. No, thank you. But moreover, why will then they never be able to achieve their end goal? Let's first analyze the side of government. What do they want? They want the corporations to feel sorry for polluting the environment. They want them to feel deterred. We don't think that they will be able to achieve these things. Why so? Now you force these corporations to have an us versus them mentality. You force these corporations to never want to subscribe to any other policies that NGOs try to lobby for. You force these corporations to never want to subscribe to all the policy changes that might occur that NGOs like PETA or NGOs like Greenpeace are trying to fight for. You force these corporations to feel antagonized. You hurt these corporations, and we don't think that at the end of the day, these corporations that you so wanted to change will subscribe to your mechanisms. Why? You make them hate these NGOs. You are robbing these individuals and harming them even more. You are making them feel that they are no longer a member of society. You are forcing these individuals to feel as if they are being constantly antagonized. These individuals will be less likely to subscribe to your mechanisms, less likely to subscribe to whatever NGOs try to propose. We don't think the end goal will be able to be achieved, right? Because we think people will not necessarily be deterred, but rather, especially those individuals that do sort of subscribe to NGOs policies or to subscribe to the views of NGOs, especially those individuals who are very extreme in nature. You force these individuals to radicalize, because you force these individuals to feel that because NGOs are doing it, it is now legitimate for me who supports the NGO to do it as well. There was no form of analysis as to whether or not it is the NGOs they are forming, they are committing eco-terrorism, or they are allowing it for a broad spectrum of society to commit it. We think it's exponentially harmful the moment you open a floor to society and you legitimize this act of terrorism. But moreover, you not cause corporations to radical themselves, because under your mechanism, under a side government's best case scenario, they are now sending a message to the corporations that the state is unable to protect myself, is the state is unable to protect me, I must now take actions into my own hands. You cause a cycle of harm and a cycle of violence, something that we from government does not want. But let's look at the long term or short term of their goal, right? Because if it were to be a short term mechanism, we think in order for this to be beneficial, your actions must be at the far ends of the extreme. Meaning, it must be so extreme to garner the form of support and to garner the form of actions, reactions that you from side government want. And we think it is very, very harmful, especially since there's no longer any check and balance to your actions. We think that's harmful. But moreover, and in their best case scenario, the moment they find this to be the long-term solution, we think that you now harm even more people, the very people that you wanted to protect. We don't think your end goal will be achieved. We think under your side it's abhorrent to allow individuals to be constantly harmed by your
our policy. When these NGOs support the action, we think that the check and balance exists within the society and the NGOs.
Listen to that recognizes there was a check and balance, but there was no check and balance. They never told us what that check and balance was. We don't think that response can be taken into consideration. But secondly, and most importantly, which side of this house best advocates? The perception of these people. You force the people on the ground to never want to subscribe or never want to support to NGOs. And even if we do recognize that there are certain individuals whose values are in line with these actions, we think the vast majority of individuals likely to subscribe to that harms the masses. To want to believe in protecting the environment when they see factories being set by for people in the middle, to want to subscribe to your form of constantly getting hurt for your actions. This distorts the very perception of these NGOs, and I think it's very, very harmful. You lose the support that these NGOs need for change. This leads me very nicely to the second level. Why then will you never be able to lobby for change under their side? We need to recognize that in order for NGOs to be able to lobby for change, they must get the support from the state, they must get the support from the people. We think that under their circumstance, you lose the support from the state because you're resorting to illegitimate actions, because you're harming the people that the state are supposed to protect, because you're harming the very people that the state is supposed to be accountable of. So you take away the legitimacy of these NGOs. When the state is against you, you will most probably not be able to achieve the form of policies that you are lobbying for. We think under their side is no longer sustainable. You force groups that disprove the environment, or you force corporations to have even more leverage not to lobby against NGOs that have tried to protect the environment, especially since now they are able to gather the support of society that says the NGOs now, the perception of NGOs, and that means do not justify the act. We don't think that eco-terrorists are accountable to the people. The government needs to be accountable for the welfare of the people, because if the government is not accountable for people, the government is accountable to no one.
You may have opposition.
this debate revolved around two things. Firstly, is terrorism in and of itself justified or necessary to fight for change, and especially in the context of environmental protection? Secondly, should these NGOs like Greenpeace or PETA then support eco-terrorism? So first point, straight from the get-go, right, we've given you loads of reasons why terrorism, especially eco-terrorism, is in and of itself unjustified. We've told you that terrorism, by definition, is actively inflicting harm against innocent third parties. We're talking about factory workers and these factories. That side is causing active harms against them in the name of environmental protection. We don't think that's something that's good, right? We also told you that the reaction by terrorism was naturally disproportionate because they cannot be held accountable for it. They have an incentive to push things to the extreme to cause massive damage without a check and balance. Thirdly, we told you that it was ineffective because since they're going against the law, now the government is actively fighting against them. We told you that the law protects everyone in society, even those profit-seeking corporations. And when eco-terrorists inflict harm against the corporation, the law does necessarily protect them and go against eco-terrorism. So we told you that their form of change is ultimately ineffective at the end of the day. The only response we got was that the environment can't protect itself and that politicians are somehow corrupt, right? And therefore NGOs should therefore protect it. We agree that environment can't protect itself. We agree that these NGOs should protect the environment. That is why they're called environmental group, right? What we don't agree is that why should they support eco-terrorism? No analysis on that side on why did the severity of the situation justify them then supporting eco-terrorism? We don't think, right? The problem is that if they're not engaging for argument that we should not use eco-terrorism, they just tell us that we need to do something, and that something happens to be eco-terrorism. But even so, right, we've proven to you a greater harm. Even if we consider all the benefits coming from that side, which by the way they never really proved, we showed you that there was a harm in showing that terrorism could somehow influence change. If terrorism could influence change, you then legitimize terrorism. That means that all the other terrorist groups in the world, like ISIS, like Al-Qaeda, the things they do to try to achieve change is now legitimized. Because if that side wants to tell you that these benefits can be achieved, then people would then be incentivized to resort to terrorism. No response from that side. The second question, possibly the more important one this debate, is should these NGOs then support eco-terrorism? Because both sides, at the end of the day, wanted to protect the environment, right? So this debate becomes who ultimately does it at the end of the day. They wanted corporations to feel deterred. They said that fines are not enough, and the simple response to that would be to increase the fine until it is enough. They said they wanted people to be deterred, but we already all these reasons, right? Ignore the analysis we gave you about why people and corporations would not react positively to extremism. They never responded to our how people would not support violent, radical means to achieve any given end. This means that a decrease in public support. This means it's harder to push for environmental protection policies under their side. We also told you that die-hard environmentalists, right, will now feel that it's okay for you to use such legitimate means because a powerful and influential NGO like Greenpeace now publicly support it. This means that you increase the amount of harms inflicted upon corporations. Given that we've proven it is ineffective, we think this is unjustified. But the third reason is that now profit-seeking corporations are now empowered to now lobby against environmental protection policies. Like things like installing sulfur scrubbers, things like making sure they don't pump pollution into rivers are now hugely undermined under that side, because since environmentalist groups are using unlawful means and corporations are using lawful means, their narrative necessarily becomes more influential than the other side. Opposition supports lawful means. We support a status quo where NGOs lobby peacefully for these sort of things. We think that our side is much more sustainable at the end of the day. For all these reasons, we're very happy to oppose.
And here for the last speech, we have proposition 10.
when state has failed, we cannot just take a step back and live in a utopian world and hope that suddenly everything will get changed. Suddenly people will deter to change, and suddenly people will just have the political power in order to change for the betterment of the environment. We think that this is something that we want to prevent, something that we need to fight for in order to take an effort and put a step in for the betterment of the environment. What is true for you today? Or should we actually allow eco-terrorism to happen? We say yes. But before I move on to that, let's have several comparisons between what they wanted to talk about and what we wanted to talk about. Firstly, we already from the start we really told you that how eco-terrorism is different from other terrorism means. We think that when the environment when there are people that constantly go against the environment and there's no one there to deter that and there's no one there to protect the environment, we think that this is a legit reason for eco-terrorism to happen when all the other means has already failed. But after what they want to talk to you about how the political change will happen under their side. We already said no to that. When nobody wants to actually protect the environment, when people think that the environment is not important, they think that we don't think that political change will happen. But if they wanted to talk to you about how the government can always increase higher taxes, we told you this. But why the government will not increase higher taxes and it won't work? Because what happened is we told you from the get-go that these people are money-minded. Like the corporations and the government needs the corporations and the factories to help them get their money, to help to get the economy working. But this is also a harm here that we talked to you about. The corporations are very rich. They are the one that campaign for the politicians in order to campaign for elections. But what happens here is they will not be able to dare to actually go against this corporation because they know that if they go against the corporation, the one that's going to be harmed is they themselves. They are accountable to this operation. They will not necessarily do so. But what happens here is that the NGOs have no one to be accountable to. The only one that they have to be accountable to is the environment. But if they wanted to talk to you about how that they will also harm the innocent, we don't necessarily think so that the NGOs will actually harm the other innocent. Because the NGOs principle is to protect the environment. And if these people are innocent, we don't see the problem. We don't see that why the NGOs will want to harm them. We think that the principle of that is still to protect the environment, and the principle within the NGOs never change. But let's also look at what they want to talk to you about, how it will hurt the environment. We don't think that this is a legit reason. If the idea that they wanted to actually harm the environment when the state was still in power, when the state still wanted to actually help them and give them like five, or when they didn't want to concede to them, when they continuously pollute the environment, we think that this is when they have to bear the consequences that they started to opt into polluting the environment. We think this is something that side opposition failed to prove. But let's also look at what we talked to you about and that they didn't want to respond. We told you about the environment. There's no one there to defend the environment, and they only wanted to talk to you about follow status quo and let the environment continue to be polluted. And hopefully one day people will start to realize. But what I also want to propose, if we create a platform for discussion to happen, we create a platform for discourse to happen where people will start to realize. But if they wanted to talk to you about how they will lose legitimacy, we really prove to you that how they won't lose legitimacy, people will more likely to support the NGO and in order to get the change. And if the change got done, we don't think that eco-terrorism would actually exist anymore. But let's look at the main issues and why side government want this issue. We really told you that how that we would allow eco-terrorism to happen in order to defend the environment, and how state has already failed. We told you how government and these politicians, how they're money-minded, and how much benefit that the corporations bring towards them will make them not want to harm this corporation in order, because they know that it will harm the corporation. The one that the corporation will harm is the politicians they themselves. We think that then what happens here is when we have a whole group, like the whole powerful people against the environment, when there's no one there to protect them, we think that this is a legit reason for eco-terrorism to happen, a platform for eco-terrorism to happen. How about we already said is that we told you that how check and balance will exist when we publicly support eco-terrorism. If people really want to carry out eco-terrorism, we think that the check and balance that exists within the society, with the society checking on the NGOs and the NGOs also checking on the society, we think that check and balance exists. But what's the flaw within their side? They want the opposition want to come and talk to you about how we legitimize all the other terrorist groups. We told you that this is different, but we think that it's extremely unfair for all the responses to come in opposition with that we cannot respond to. We are very proud with the debate.
I just read the